Hi, we're Group O, and the topic of our video is the effect of rising carbon dioxide levels on the nutritional content of plants, when bigger isn't always better.
Have you ever thought about your daily activity and how it may impact the life of a plant? No, not just the vegetables that you eat, but ones you may not have even known existed? Well, guess what? Many of our actions are negatively impacting our earth and plants, but before we get too broad, let's get to the basics. I am sure you have heard of the greenhouse effect, the thermal radiation from a planet's surface that is first absorbed by greenhouse gases and then returned back to the atmosphere and all the bad that it is doing. Surprisingly, if it were not for greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, and nitrous oxide, the Earth would be too cold to even inhabit and be unrecognizable. However, too many of these gases have proved to not be a good thing, especially carbon dioxide. Since the industrial boom in the 1950s, CO2 levels have been rising at an extremely fast rate. Since 1958, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere measured by parts per million has increased from approximately 312 parts per million to 398 parts per million. CO2 is the main cause for global warming and climate change since it's mostly produced by human activities, aka anthropogenic human origin emissions. The three biggest causes are the fossil fuel emissions, which are like driving your car, deforestation, and agriculture contributing to increased greenhouse gases like the methane produced by manure. Since the great rise in CO2, there's been a correlating increase in temperature, and humans are not the only living species affected by climate. The nutrient level of plants in response to the rise in CO2 has been recently looked into and is what we will be discussing in this video.
One of the most recent studies has found that the rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide has had a negative impact on the nutrient quality of wheat grain. In 2012, the University of Gothenburg conducted a study that evaluated the effects of atmospheric carbon dioxide. This study included 43 field experiments with 17 different varieties of wheat carried out in 10 different countries across 4 continents. Higher levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide stimulate the photosynthesis and growth of most plants. However, because the plants do not usually increase their uptake of nutrients to a corresponding degree, the plants themselves will have a lower nutritional value. In this grain, a lower level of the nutrient nitrogen results in a lower protein content. This means poor nutritional quality. Professor Plihil, the professor in charge of the university study at University of Gothenburg, explains why this protein is an essential part of the crop, saying, "Protein content is the most important quality aspect for crops, with implications for both nutritional value and the baking properties of the grain." What this professor found from this experiment was that even though there was often an increase in the crop sizes, the decrease in protein showed that the higher level of CO2 had a negative impact on the plant's ability to absorb nitrogen. Nitrogen uptake does not keep up with the pace of the increased growth of wheat, and it dilutes the amount of nitrogen in the crop. Wheat and rice are the world's most important crops quantitatively. Wheat grain is also unusually rich in protein and provides the human race with the most protein overall. This being said, we see that a decrease in protein in these plants will have a huge effect on the world that we live in and the nutritional value of the daily wheat intake.
This experiment demonstrated the diminishing protein content of crops based on higher CO2 levels, but an even larger experiment was carried out in 2014 by multiple universities over 6 growth years in Australia, Japan, and the United States. Using a system called the Free Air Concentration Enrichment System, also known as FACE, researchers were able to change the amount of CO2 that plants were exposed to from the current 400 parts per million to between 546 and 586 parts per million, which is what they expected to be around the middle of the century. The results were quite interesting. Wheat, rice, peas, and soybeans had significantly diminished levels of zinc and iron. Wheat, which we discussed was already one of the world's staple sources of protein, had a sizable 9.3% drop in zinc. However, corn and sorghum were largely unaffected. Why is that? Well, it's because they are C4 plants, whereas the other crops are C3 plants. Basically, C4 plants use a faster type of photosynthesis, which makes them more resistant to the changing conditions. However, the drops in zinc and iron in key C3 crops can have large implications. So, using the Free Air Concentration Enrichment System, scientists are able to simulate the expected CO2 levels of around the year 2050, and the resulting effects are definitely striking. About 2 billion people on our planet rely on C3 grains and legumes as their primary dietary source of zinc and iron, and the majority of these people are already deficient in these key nutrients, causing an estimated loss of 63 million life years annually. But there's increased quantity of food, even though there's a loss of quality, so everyone should be fine, right? Not quite. Despite plants finding it easier to extract carbon dioxide from the air to make carbohydrates, scientists actually predict that crop yields could fall in a warmer world. In fact, a study conducted at the University of Illinois showed that carbon dioxide levels, similar to those studied using the phase system, resulted in lowered pest resistance, causing twice as much crop damage from 3 major crop pests. So potentially, we could end up with less nutritious food, and because of other factors involved with increased CO2 levels, like altered climates and these pests, we might not make enough to compensate for it. But have no fear, scientists are hard at work with potential solutions. Rice was shown to have varying responses to the increased carbon dioxide levels, which makes it a good candidate for a crop that is resistant to the inevitable increase in atmospheric CO2. Genetic engineering is also a viable path, and scientists are hard at work to design new plants that will thrive in new conditions that will appear. Ultimately, these crops are extremely vital to billions of people on Earth, so it is imperative that we find a solid solution to maintain their nutritional value in years to come.